When it comes time to making the decision to sew, sometimes the hardest part is in learning how to read patterns. So, today we're going to be talking about how you can go about reading your patterns so that way you can be one step closer to making the wardrobe of your dreams. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. My name is Aaronica Cole, and I am the host, owner, etc. of Aaronica B. Cole & Co., where I do make sewing simple and fun for everyone. I do specialize in plus sizes because I want to make sure that inclusion is actually a for real thing versus just a cute little trendy word that we use when we decide that we want to get more money from plus size bodies. I digress. So whether you are stitching up a storm and making that wardrobe of your dreams already, or you're threading your first needle, you are in the right place. So with that, let's go ahead and get started on today's content, which is, of course, about reading patterns. So before we actually get into learning how to read patterns, I just want to share with you all that not knowing how to read patterns is actually a pretty common thing. When I was 13 and I started sewing with a machine, I did not learn how to read patterns in the one class that I took, which honestly really makes me think that that class was pointless, but I digress. So I didn't learn how to read patterns. So when I made my very first dress when I was 22, 23 for that New Year's, and it barely stayed on, okay, a lot of the things that deterred me was because I didn't know how to read patterns. And I actually didn't learn how to read a pattern until I was probably like 30-ish. Okay. And it was after I had my second child. And at that point in time, I had become a little bit more proficient with sewing. I had created some of my own patterns and things like that. And I was literally just kind of doing the best that I could with what it is that I had. Now, I did learn how to read patterns by pattern testing indie patterns because it wasn't until then that I actually understood. I even had like this tiny little booklet that was like, oh, learn how to sew or beginner's guide to sewing, but it was supposed to be like this kind of cliff notes to sewing. And yeah, I looked at that thing and I was like, what do any of these words and symbols even mean? So we're going to obviously talk about the words. We're going to talk about the symbols. We're going to talk a little bit about some jargon that is sewing based. So that way, as we talk more in other videos, you'll have a really good understanding of what these things mean and how these things play into one, the patterns that you choose, two, the sizes that you choose, three, how you cut those fabrics out. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into things first. The first thing that we want to talk about, of course, are some of the tools that make cutting out your patterns a little bit easier. Okay. So the first thing obviously is going to be your fabric shears. These are a super huge pair. They do not have to be this big, obviously, but you're going to want to make sure that you protect these with your life. Why? Because once you start to cut like out paper and things like that with your fabric shears, it severely dulls them. Can you get them sharpened? It depends on the quality of the shear that you use. I highly suggest doing a tulip pink. Tulip pink actually makes it, hands down, in my opinion, not only the most pretty fabric things, or rather sewing notions, but also they are high quality. Also, Fiskars is great, Ulfa, as well as I think it's like Guggenheim or something like that. You can get it from Joann's. It starts with a G. Forgive me for messing that up. Hands down, though, the best scissors on the planet are probably going to be the Kai scissors. And they are also probably going to be one of the most priciest, but they are worth it, okay? You know how you can do those, you see people doing those tests where it's like, oh, I'm cutting through 25 layers of denim. They're cutting through it with those Kai scissors. And those babies are sharp, okay? So, of course, fabric shears, top tier, right? And that's if you are not using a rotary cutter. Again, listen, iridescent is like my favorite color. I stand for it. So a lot of my stuff is going to be iridescent. Judge someone else, okay? So I personally am a user of a rotary cutter because I actually cut on a cutting mat. My entire cutting table is covered with a mat that is a self-healing mat, essentially a super large version of this here. Okay. Now, a cutting mat is not going to be necessary if you don't necessarily plan on using a rotary cutter. Now, it is helpful in the event that you do decide to use pins when you are like pinning your pattern to your fabric, but it is not 100% necessary, right? You can use it or you could not. Something else that is very, very helpful, of course, are we've got these clips. So these are one version of clip, right? And then, of course, we also have the Wonder clips, which I feel like are more popular than this style clip. I got these in a sewing kit box, which I love, obviously, because they're iridescent and they are along with my color coordinated. But these, of course, are the Wonder clips that I was talking about as far as another version of clips. Of course, you can also use pins. We all know what those straight pins look like. Now, one of the tools that I do want to share with you is actually a marking tool, and it is a notch marking tool. But if you are like, hey, I don't necessarily want to cut fabric, that sort of thing, that's fine. But let me grab this tool and show you what that is as well. Okay, so when it comes time to actually marking your notches, this is a mark notching tool where you squeeze it, and it essentially functions very similar to that of a hole punch, just so that you can kind of get a feel for what this looks like. This is a piece of scrap fabric that I have. And when using the mark notching tool, you just kind of go in between the tool, and then you get a little hole that is right here with the mark notcher. Now, if you're like, okay, so that's great, I love that for you, but what are some of the other options? In addition to, of course, your traditional tailor's chalk, we also have pens. These are heat erasable pens. They are, this version is, I got this from the TikTok shop, and I love them because there's so many colors. Why is having a bunch of different colors important? Because depending upon the fabric, you may need a different color to mark and have it show up. But these are heat erasable, so once you apply the like an iron, the marking will go away. Fantastic option for when it comes time to marking your notches. Okay. So why is it important to mark notches? Notches really help you to get things lined up in the proper way. So if you are, say, attaching a collar to a shirt and you mark the notch, it'll let you know how close to being accurate you are when it comes time for you to put that on. Same thing with like putting on the waistband for some pants. It just helps you to line things up so that you know that you are in essence making the decisions that will help you to accurately put that waistband on. So, but let's get into the next thing, which are understanding sewing patterns and symbols and lines. Okay. So now I'm going to be pulling out, of course, my Know Me pattern because shameless self-promotion. Also, I will be doing a hack for this for summertime coming up. Okay. So actually, the first thing that we're going to start off with is reading the back of an envelope just like this, okay? Because I feel like, yes, while many of us have moved towards the indie patterns where we're downloading these things, a lot of the same things are going to be in that area. Now, while it's not on an envelope, it is on the inside of the pattern, but being able to read and understand all of this information is going to be key for you, okay? So the first up, we've got, of course, and we're going to be starting on this side. So we're going to be starting on the far left side as far as reading goes, okay? So first up is, of course, the suggested fabrics. Generally speaking, it's going to let you know what fabrics will work for it. Meaning, what was this pattern actually drafted for? Was it drafted for wovens? Was it drafted for knits? Was it drafted for two-way stretch knits or four-way stretch knits? That is, in essence, what this is going to tell you. So, for example, for this here pattern, the suggested fabrics are stretch knits only, such as double knit. So like a French terry or a scuba or a Liverpool, ITY, sweater knit. And then it's advising you to see the stretch gauge, which we will go over soon. Then it talks about the sizing, and they have Mrs. sizing in the US as well as European sizes. And then it goes down to showcase or highlight the bust, waist, hip measurements, as well as the back to waist measurement. This is an important measurement because if you hold more height in your upper body, you might need to add more length here. Similarly, if you do not hold your height and you're a little bit shorter, and this is not where you're holding your height at, you might need to make it a little bit smaller, shorter, in order for this garment to hit you at the right places where it was designed to. It also speaks to interfacing and needing interfacing. It talks about how many yards of fabric that you need in order for you to, of course, have enough interfacing in order to interface properly. For this pattern, you need 20 inches or half of a yard. And then it talks about the total yardage needed in order to complete the dresses. Now, this has two different views. One is a solid, the other is a color blocked version. So it specifies based off of what version you would like to make in order for you to accurately get enough yardage for fabric. So the largest size is going to require 2 3/8 yards, or rather, actually 3 3/8 yards of fabric. Okay. But when you choose your size, and it actually says it on the bottom of here, it says, please refer to the English guide for the finished measurements. Now on this here, we do actually have English and we've got French on the other side. So let's take a look at the actual pattern pattern directions, because this is going to be where the rest of the information is that we're going to need to follow. Okay. First up, like I said, are those finished garment measurements. Now, the finished garment measurements are actually going to be what you should probably use to decide what size you want to make. Why? Because it's going to factor in how much ease is built into the pattern. If you're like, girl, what do you mean by ease? Please tell me what that means. Ease, in essence, speaks to the way that your body measurements are compared to the finished garment measurements. If you're working with a more fitted garment, there's going to be negative ease, meaning that the finished garment is going to be less than what your body actually measures. Why? Because you want that fabric to stretch to go around your body. Okay. Just like if you are working with a woven pattern, or a pattern that has been developed for woven fabrics, you're going to have positive ease, meaning that the finished measurements are going to be larger than your actual body measurements. Why? Because woven fabrics, they don't stretch, which means that in order for it to fit comfortably on your body, it's going to have to be looser. So that way it has that fit, right? Now, even if you're going to be doing something like a pencil skirt that is fitted, there is still going to be a positive ease if it's been designed for woven fabrics. Why? Because our bodies, they tend to squish when we sit down or get larger, that sort of thing. And your clothing should accommodate that. Okay. So when we are looking at our finished measurements, which is on that first page of these directions, right? We're going to take a look at, and for example, if we're looking at the size 10, it says that the bust body measurement is 32.5, whereas the finished measurement is 32. So as we can even see there, and it's demonstrated that there is negative ease. And we also see that the waist measurement is 25, but the finished measurement is 28. So that speaks to it being a little bit baggier on the waist. But if you're like, okay, so I would like for my waist to be even bigger, then of course you could size up in that area. Just like the finished hip measurement is 36, but the body measurement is 34.5. So that speaks to having more ease in it. Okay. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, as we get larger in size, that actually changes, right? So, and that's because they are trying to accommodate more of the plus sizes, right? So for the size 38, we've got a bust body measurement of 60, and the finished measurement is 59, giving it 1 inch of negative ease. Just like the waist measurement for body measurement is 54.5, and the waist body finished measurement is 55, again, speaking to that ease. Okay. So now if I wanted it to fit tighter, for example, how it fits in here, right? So this fits me a little bit more snug than say it was possibly designed for, because this is actually how I like for it to fit. You can size down. So you'll know exactly how much to size down by looking at those finished measurements. Similarly, if you are looking at a garment that is designed for woven fabrics, especially if you're looking at that waist or hip band, and you're like, okay, so I know that my waist is way smaller than my hips, then you can take a look at those finished measurements to see exactly where you would like for it to end for comfortability as well as fit post making. Okay. So that is taking a look at, of course, our finished measurements and utilizing those finished measurements to actually decide what size it is you want to make based off of how much ease is designed with that pattern. The next thing that we're going to go over, of course, is going to be our pattern symbols as well as lines. Okay, so let's get into these pattern markings, right? So we've got first up, which is the grain line. The grain line is delineated by the arrow that shows, in essence, which way the grain line is, whether it is north to south, east to west, or if you are more vertical, horizontal, right? So that is going to, in essence, you're going to be wanting to make sure that you follow the grain of the fabric. And it's normally parallel to the selvage or the fold, unless, of course, you're cutting on the bias. In that case, you're going to see your grain line going diagonal. But either way, that line with the arrow is going to be what tells you the direction of the grain line. Next up is the place on the fold fabric or marking. And what that looks like is almost like a not complete rectangle, if that makes sense. And it's just going to be, that's what it shows, is like it's kind of like a three-sided rectangle, and typically it will say place on the fold or fold line or something along those lines. And in essence, what you're doing is you're folding your fabric in half and lining that up with the fabric, right? So that's going to delineate that right there. Buttonhole markings are, in essence, just a straight line with two straight ends on the other. It almost looks like an extended H. And that indicates exactly the length as well as the placement of buttonholes in the event that you need them. And then, of course, we have the X that marks the buttonhole, or rather the button marking, not the buttonhole, okay? Then we have notches and symbols. There are a couple of different types of notches that you'll see. One, of course, is going to be a single triangle, meaning that you are going to line up another single triangle along with it. A double triangle as well. Now, typically the single triangle is what identifies the front of the, say, either the bodice or something along those lines. And then the double triangle symbolizes the back. Then you've got, of course, the small dot, right, which is just a small circle. The small circle will actually normally be labeled on there for what that's for, as well as like your squares and other triangles. All these notches and symbols do is indicate that you're going to have to line something up with that, right? So do you need to mark all of these? Yes, I would. Absolutely. Especially if we're dealing with woven fabrics, okay? Now, the circle with a, in essence, a like cross on the inside, that indicates the bust line, waistline, hip, or biceps, right? So that is important because when it comes time to attaching those waistbands, or when it comes time to attaching neck bands and that sort of thing, that's going to be important for you to pay attention to. And that's also going to help you to identify where you can make some adjustments, right? Now, seam allowance is something that is not typically identified on the pattern pieces, and there aren't really markings on there for that. But make sure that you have checked out what your seam allowance is in your pattern instructions. For like generally speaking, the design group patterns, which of course are Nomi, Butterick, Simplicity, Vogue, and McCall's, right? Those are typically a 5/8 seam allowance unless otherwise indicated. Okay. but those are generally speaking not going to be put on the pattern pieces. Again, you're going to have to read for that. Now, we did go over how to maintain seam allowance in another video, so I will link that right here so that you can see what I mean by maintaining that seam allowance, okay? So how is it that you make adjustments? Because every pattern comes with the adjust if necessary and kind of how to do that, right? So if you are shorter, right? So I talked about that neck to, in essence, waist. If you're measuring shorter, or if you do your side waist measurement and that measures shorter, then it's in essence, you're going to be folding your fabric up or folding your pattern piece up however many inches you need. Now, I will say that there is a pretty standard, right, as far as how you do that. In a knit fabric, if you have, it's kind of like a 1/2 to 1. So if you've got an inch of difference in your body, then you do a 1/2 inch difference in your actual pattern piece. So for example, your side waist measurement, generally speaking, the standard is 8.5. So let's say if you measure 9.5 for your side waist, you will add in a 1/2 of an inch in the pattern piece to accommodate that length, okay? Similarly, if you are measuring a 7.5, you're going to subtract 1/2 of an inch versus the full inch, okay? That's for knit fabrics. Now, if you are working with woven fabrics, it is a 1-to-1. Why? Because there's no vertical stretch, okay? So to lengthen, just like how you would shorten by folding up, to lengthen, you would cut that pattern piece and add in the length that you need and tape it back together, okay? So that is something to do very, very quickly. Those are quick adjustments to make. If you're talking about needing higher rise or a full booty adjustment, a full bust adjustment, we will not be covering that today in this video. But if you guys are like, hey girl, can you please help me out with that as well? Just drop a comment and I will make a video that is about some of those adjustments as well. Okay. So now let's really talk about fabric recommendations. Why is fabric recommendation so important when it comes to our patterns, right? Because oftentimes we put those suggested fabrics there because that is what the garment has been designed for, or the pattern has been designed for. Now, let's say if you've got a really beautiful woven fabric and you're like, oh, I really love this aesthetic and I love this style. I really want to make this out of it. But the pattern has been designed for a knit fabric. Again, as we saw with those finished measurements where there's positive and negative ease, if there is negative ease in that pattern, you're going to have to make adjustments for it if you decide to use a woven fabric for a knit pattern. But if you're using a knit fabric for a woven pattern, you can pretty easily do that by sizing down, okay? Now, I say that because I don't want y'all to learn the hard way, the way that I did, that you cannot use woven fabrics for knit patterns because your girl made a lot of mistakes. And I don't want that for you, okay? Now, again, if you are saying to yourself, hey, I really want to make this knit dress out of a woven fabric, just know that you're probably going to have to size up just because of the ease that has been built in with those patterns, okay? Is it possible? Absolutely. Now, suggested fabrics are there just purely for suggestion. That does not mean that you have to do it. So, for example, the suggested fabrics for this here pattern are stretch knits only, such as double knit, ITY, sweater knit, right? This here on the cover, this was made out of a scuba knit. This one was done out of 2 French terry fabrics, okay? So neither of those were specifically put on here as a suggested fabric, but I still used them, right? Because they are a knit fabric. So this is really, yes, they are going to be suggestions made on here, but it's really going to challenge how well you know your fabrics as well, right? So if you're like, Aaronica, how do I know if it'll work? There is a stretch gauge that is included. And I want to say that we put the stretch gauge on the actual pattern pieces themselves. But it's like, okay, girl, well, what's a stretch gauge? Yeah, it's on the, okay, so yes, this is on the stretch gauge is on the actual pattern pieces. What a stretch gauge does, though, is it tells you how much percentage of stretch that fabric contains. You hold the fabric like at one length, and I will make sure that I actually include that, like what the picture of that looks like in here. Don't worry. Um, but you in essence are just measuring it based off of what this piece of paper shows you. And it tells you how much stretch is here for it, right? And that helps in deciding whether or not that stretch knit fabric is going to work for a knit pattern, okay? So that is what that a stretch gauge does. So what I do want to do, of course, is make sure that we also go over what it means to cut on the fold. Why? Because sometimes we don't actually have enough fabric to cut on the fold. It's happened to me plenty of times. So for example, like these sleeves, these were designed to be cut on the fold, yes, but also like I had to add in some here. And adding in or not being able to cut on the fold is sometimes a thing depending upon what you're making, how much fabric you have, whether or not you laid it out properly. So when you're cutting on the fold, that in essence means that you are cutting that garment. Literally, you're folding the fabric in half, lining the pattern piece up and cutting it on the fold. But also, what happens if you can't cut on the fold? Then what you do is you just leave enough space on the two fabrics that will allow you to, in essence, create a fold by adding in a seam. And I think it's important to highlight that because not very many people talk about that. And then if your fabric is not fabricking the way that you wanted it to, and you feel like you can't now make this garment, you actually can. Just go ahead and make sure that you have lined it up to give yourself a little bit of extra space so that you can, in essence, sew your fold for that garment. Okay. So I just wanted to highlight that very quickly. Again, you don't necessarily need a notch tool, but I will say that it is very important for you to mark your notches, whether or not you are sewing a tissue pattern like this, whether you have printed off your pattern and you are using it. Those notches are designed to help your pattern come together with ease and more precise nature to it. So make sure that you're marking those notches. Oftentimes, if a color is like lopsided or something like that, it could have been prevented if you would have lined things up with the notches. This is also especially important if you're in like the jumpsuit making business. By business, I actually mean you just love making jumpsuits. Why? Because listen, you have to make sure that center of your bodice is lined up perfectly with the center of your pants, or you're going to be constantly shifting all day because one side is going to be going this way, the other side is going to be going the other way, and it doesn't feel good. Ask me how I know. Don't ask me. I'm supposed to be a professional. But either way, that is something to keep in mind. So that wraps up this here YouTube video on how to read patterns. I promise you it's not as hard as you would think. I do think that the patterns, especially the ones that come from the design group, have gotten a lot easier to read. So for example, again, pulling out this pattern, also this was a super easy pattern to make. If you have not bought it and made it, what are you waiting on? But again, we've got like the directions that say stitch front 1, which is identifying the pattern piece together at the center front, leaving open above the small dot. Again, we talked about the dot, right? So again, it's identifying how that notch comes into play with the actual directions. Then it's saying stitch back sections together at the center back, right? And we know that when we're putting our garments together, unless we are doing a French seam, our right sides are together. And then it's stitch front to back at the shoulder seams and sides in a double stitch seam. Okay, so I didn't do any of that. And now you know you're probably like, girl, well, why didn't you do it? Why? Because I used a serger and I didn't have to, right? Then it's reinforce the collar, right? So they're using a lot of the terminology that is easier for us to process. Whereas I promise you, when I was coming up and I was trying to read patterns, that's not what it said. It said all these other things, okay? So just take into account how those notches play into your actual pattern instructions. The one final tip that I have when it comes to reading your pattern instructions is read the instructions fully from step 1 to the final step for whatever version that you are making. So that way, you know, as you're cutting out your pattern and you're marking your notches, you're making that mental note for what that actual notch is for versus feeling like, okay, wait, why am I doing this? Is there even a purpose to this? You know what I'm saying? So just be mindful of that because that is going to make a very big difference as far as just making notches that make sense. So with that, thank you so much for joining me for today's video on how to read sewing patterns. I hope that that was helpful for you. If it was helpful, make sure that you have shared this with someone else who is on their Learn to Sew journey so that it can help them as well. And be sure to drop a comment if you have not already subscribed. Why haven't you? Also, make sure that you subscribe and turn on the bell for notifications. And if you were like, hey girl, I really love your videos, be sure to go ahead and buy me a super and show your love. Until next time, stay cute and stay crafty.